Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Linda Hutchinson, and I'd like to welcome you to the fifth and final session of our workshop, Is Media Ruining America? This week, we're excited to present a panel of experts to weigh in on what we've learned over the past few weeks. But before I begin, I would like to say just a few words about the League of Women Voters. We are nonpartisan. We do not endorse political parties or candidates, but we do take positions on issues, and our positions on information access and media literacy have been clear throughout this series of workshops. We believe that citizens have a right to know what their government is doing, that credible and ethical journalism is essential to democracy, and that media literacy should be taught in schools and throughout the broader community. Please note that we will take questions from the chat at the end of this Q&A session. So now I'd like to introduce our panel. These folks bring a wealth of expertise and experience to the topics at hand, and I know we're all anxious to hear what they have to say. Professor Jeff Borg has taught us the political science faculty at the Larimer campus of the Front Range Community College in Fort Collins for 20 years. He teaches classes in American government, state and local government, comparative government, and international relations. Before teaching at Front Range, Jeff directed the Denver Justice and Peace Committee and served for 13 years as a United Methodist and Mennonite pastor in Iowa and Colorado. Dr. Nikhil Krishnaswamy is an associate professor of computer science at Colorado State University and director of the Situated Grounding and Natural Language Lab. His research focuses on diverse forms of natural language and multimodal understanding in human-AI collaboration, and on the mathematical and logical properties of AI models. He has been featured in national outlets such as NPR and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Natalie Pennington is an associate professor of communications studies at Colorado State University. She received her PhD from the University of Kansas, and her research interests are in how people engage with communication technology and the impact that can have on relationships and well-being. Dr. Pennington's work has been spotlighted in various outlets, including The Atlantic, Time Magazine, and U.S. News and World Report. John Vahlenkamp is regional editor for Prairie Mountain Media, which has newsrooms covering communities on the Northern Front Range, including Boulder, Longmont, Loveland, Greeley, and Estes Park. A resident of Longmont, he has worked in Colorado newsrooms for over 30 years. He is a father of 6 and enjoys being outdoors, playing basketball with buddies, and watching the Broncos. I have to say, we also had Dr. David Wolfgang of CSU's Journalism and Media Studies scheduled to be on the panel, but he lost his voice over the weekend and he will not be able to join us. We wish him a speedy recovery. And now I'll turn this over to Dan Dworkin, a fellow League member who will serve as our moderator for the evening.
Thanks, Linda. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our panel. We'll begin this evening's discussion by asking each panelist a question or questions related to their area of expertise, and then invite the other panelists to weigh in on that question as well. And later on, we'll ask a more general question addressed to the entire panel. And then if time allows, we'll take questions from the audience. Professor Borg, if we can, let's begin with you. In the earlier sessions of this program, we learned that there are more and more malign actors posing as journalists and influencers today. But we also know there are reputable journalists and media outlets out there who believe passionately in the public good and offer valid reporting on the issues of the day. How can we identify, follow, and support ethical reporters and news outlets?
Well, thanks, and thanks for inviting me. Let me just check in. How long do you want our responses to be?
Well, we
Just
have
to
a
get an
time
idea.
limit. Maybe 5 minutes per
Okay.
question, do you think?
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So from a political science perspective, I think one thing we like to think about is the structure of the media in the United States. And given that there's two important points that we talk about in like when we teach American government. But the first one is the fact that the media is privately owned. It's a business in the United States, primarily. And then the second fact is the concentration of the media, which has happened the last 20, 30 years. So on the first one concern when the media is privately owned, if it's a business, and whether you have a TV station or a newspaper, a lot of the revenue comes from advertising. So you wonder if there's a distortion then, if the media outlet is driven to sell more advertising, therefore increase audience size, whether that distorts then what kind of news gets covered. Now, the alternative is public ownership of the media, and we have two of those in the United States. We have public broadcasting, PBS, and NPR. The problem there is that they, as we've seen, they are subject to the whims of Congress or who's in the White House. I mean, President Trump tried to, through executive orders, cut some substantial amount of funding from both of those, but luckily Congress put some of that money back. But the one thing I wanted to mention too is the rise of nonprofit media outlets, and to me, it seems like this sort of exploded in, well, maybe a minor explosion has happened since the mid 2000s. We've had the rise of independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit media outlets. And so there is an organization now called the Institute for Nonprofit News. And they were founded, I think, in 2009. And they have a really interesting website. If you're interested, it's INN Independent Institute for Nonprofit News. And they say on their website they support and network with over 500 independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit news organizations throughout the country. So that gives you kind of an idea of like how many are out there. And they go from everything like national groups, like I'm sure most people have heard of ProPublica, a national nonprofit group that does investigative journalism. And then, of course, then, other media then will pick up stories from, say, ProPublica and then run it, republish it or repackage it. So you might hear on NPR stories that originate with ProPublica. Or at the state level, we have here in Colorado, the Colorado Sun is a really good example of nonprofit newspaper that started here. And ProPublica started in, what was it, 2007. Colorado Sun is a little bit later, 2018. But it raises money from donations and grants and really tries to practice. I think it's probably the best news source in Colorado right now. Yeah, thanks, Linda, for putting that link up there. And then, of course, there's local news outlets too that have gone to more of a nonprofit model there. So there's also something called the American Journalism Project. They practice something called venture philanthropy, where they just, they have a bunch of money and they try to fund, startup nonprofit media and then sustain it. So the second thing, the concentration of the news media in the United States has really accelerated lately. In our, just for instance, our American government textbook that we use, it's got this amazing graph that in 1983, 90% of the media was controlled by 50 companies, 50 companies. But by 2021, 90% of the media is now controlled by just 4 companies, right? And the list then, and they're recombining all the time, right? So the list at that point was Comcast, Disney, Viacom, CBS, and Warner Brothers, right? So then that's a concern, right? Because the fewer and fewer corporations or outlets that control the media, then we lose the diversity and opinion and people that are actually interested in doing positive investigative reporting. So my takeaway here is the two things that we can do is, one, support nonprofit news organizations like, say, the Colorado Sun, and then also try to consume media that 10% of media that is not controlled by the four
Yeah.
mega corporations. So that's sort of my opening remarks there.
Okay. Would anyone on the panel like to add to this? No?
Sure.
Oh,
First of all, yeah, I think I agree. I think the Colorado Sun is a great publication. I'm fortunate to know several people who work there. I've used to work with them. So agreed. And in terms of the fact that there are fewer large organizations that own a larger percentage of the media, I have to, granted, we're part of that. I work for a larger company, much larger than I used to work for. I, when it comes, back to the question of determining good actors, bad actors here, how do you distinguish between who's doing really good work and who's simply maybe using the platform for some other purpose? Um, Within our own markets here, we do still have small local newsrooms. We still have people who work in those newsrooms who live in the communities that they work in. I'll use the Reporter-Herald as an example. Jocelyn Rowley, who covers Loveland City Council, lives in Loveland. Um, when people ask me about which media they can trust, how do I know that I'm getting accurate information? What I would tell people is find the people reporting who are closest in proximity to what's going on. And one thing I appreciate about what we do is that we make ourselves available to the public. When someone does have a complaint or a concern or a need, we're reachable. So everyone knows, in Loveland, for instance, everyone knows who it is that's covering schools or covering city government or covering criminal justice matters. We're reachable, and when we do something, when we make a mistake, we hear about it. We know, and and we have a personal reputation there. So regardless of the market, though, I'm not only speaking about Loveland. When it comes to who you can trust for news, my take is, yeah, you go to someone who is closest to what happens and who has their name on it. I think putting your name on what you do is very important. And so, if there's any question from anyone listening out here, how do I know what I can trust? Find someone who puts their reputation on the line when it comes to the accuracy of what they do.
and who is held accountable for what they say, right? Yeah. Any other brief comments?
Well, can I just say too that just because say a newspaper is controlled by a much larger corporation doesn't mean that it's not a good source of information or is responsible. And some big corporations are more responsible than others too. So I mean, I just have to contrast what the Fort Collins, Colorado one, which is owned by Gannett, which is a huge conglomerate, right? Versus the Reporter-Herald, the Longmont paper, and the Boulder paper, all owned now by Prairie Media. And I mean, eventually that's owned by Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund that that bought the Denver Post. But that doesn't mean that you can't still have local reporters covering stuff. I mean, I think I've been impressed that the Loveland Reporter-Herald actually does more local and has more detailed reporting locally, say, than the Fort Collins, Colorado does. So it really depends on the outlet you're talking about.
Any comments? Okay, let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, or AI. Dr. Krishnaswamy, it seems like AI is advancing at a furious rate, almost faster than our ability to anticipate and manage the outcomes. What, if anything, keeps you up at night about the recent explosion of AI and its potential to disrupt our lives and our democracy, especially when it comes to its potential impact on the elections? And what can we do to mitigate the risks?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for the invitation. I guess there's a number of things that keep me occupied with respect to the rapid growth of AI and its capabilities. But with respect to media and democracy in particular, I think the biggest thing that I see as a concern is this sort of reality distorting effect that it has. So somewhat piggybacking on the last topic about how to attribute, quality to media and accountability, we also have to consider that in part, AI companies are kind of acting as their own media companies in some ways. And it's not in the way that we traditionally think of media, because what's happening is not that OpenAI has a reporting division, but it's that people are using these tools independently to kind of create media and proliferate media that fits into their own landscape. And we see this with, say, TikTok Reels, for example. It becomes increasingly hard to tell when something is just actually somebody filming versus AI generated, because the quality of the models are so good now. And that leads to a challenge in discriminating good from bad actors, because it is so easy to generate a realistic looking video that has, an explicit or implicit point to it, and that could be, sent out by an account that has an agenda, underlying agenda, and then it gets shared widely, and that all of a sudden kind of cements its place in people's headspace with respect to that story. And so if you don't have the kind of epistemic vigilance, which is a term we use in my research, of just trying to determine, sort of maintaining a guard on where you are absorbing your information from. If you don't maintain an appropriate level of epistemic vigilance, then it becomes very easy to assume that something that you see is true when it is in fact not true. Sometimes this is innocuous, right? It's annoying when you see like a cute cat video and it turns out to be AI generated, but it's overall not harmful. But when you see a generated video of, say, a public figure saying something they didn't actually say, well, that is actually introducing false signal into your own personal media landscape. And so I think what we see is, it's been known for some time, about a decade now, that partisan identity is a strong sorter of media consumption. And so it's almost like, conservatives and liberals and, people of various political persuasions basically live in independent or semi-independent media bubbles. And AI has accelerated this dramatically, because not only are you now consuming media from, say, MS Now versus Fox News, that was sort of how it was maybe 10 years ago, and that's still part of the equation. But now it's just like, okay, yeah, you're consuming media from these two different, divergent major sources, but those two sources still might interview some subset of the same people. But in addition to that, you are now consuming media from a host of like online creators who are just completely independent of each other, kind of actively have agendas that they are at various levels of sort of openly forwarding. And so this really allows us to consume, curate, and therefore narrow and just sort of sharpen our own specific media bubbles. And it becomes really, really hard to break out of that, because um, what that does is it makes you more predisposed to seek out and accept things that reinforce your existing worldview. Um, and what AI does in this space is actually a dramatic accelerant to this. And it's really comes back to the way these things are trained, because one of the key mechanisms in AI training is something called reinforcement learning for human feedback. Without getting into too much of the technical detail, reinforcement learning basically means if the system gets rewarded for doing something, then it does more of it. And human feedback means that humans are providing those rewards. And so as a result, if you've ever used a chatbot, one thing that it will often do is it will try to agree with you as much as possible. It will basically try to craft responses that reinforce the presuppositions that were in the input. And so we see this in cases where, let's say you have two people who are using ChatGPT. Sorry about the balloons. I have these Zoom gestures turned on. I forgot. When you do two fingers, it shows balloons. So let's say you have two people, one and one, using ChatGPT to mitigate their relationship difficulties. So they're basically using the same system, but they're independently feeding it their perspective on a troubled relationship. It will tell one person one thing that reinforces their perspective, and one person something that reinforces the other perspective. Right? Same machine, different inputs, different outputs, because it's trained to reinforce the perspective of the user. And it becomes really hard to to disengage from that. And you need that epistemic vigilance to be skeptical about what the AI is telling you because it's predisposed to reinforce your own perspective. And so then you have to be able to interrogate your own perspective critically. And that goes for media. And then you add to the fact that these things are coming at you at 60 frames a second, often in the form of like 30 to 1 minute clips. And just the sheer barrage of information that's coming at you from all angles really, really does distort your sense of reality. So, I'll conclude. I was recently talking to a faculty member who works in mental health and was saying that AI has created a whole new spate of anxieties and psychoses that are now an artifact of the 2020s that simply weren't there before, right? These were not things that psychiatrists were treating even 5 years ago that are now showing up, in clinical settings. And I think it really speaks to how fast things are moving, and we doing the science necessarily are predisposed to do things slowly so we can do things right. And so we're almost necessarily doing research on a model that was, a couple of months old, which is already out of date. And so I would like to hear from the rest of the panel and the audience because I'm hopeful that maybe by the end of this discussion we can come up with some ideas of like what practices we can put in place to mitigate this effect because it's something that's the thing that's been keeping me up at night, over the last couple of months.
Anyone else like to comment on that?
I'll skin for just a second about two things that you said. One is I do want to reinforce that I'm absolutely seeing that media fragmentation so aggressively. I'm so sad that Dr. Wolfgang isn't here. I actually work with David on some data that we collected at Colorado State for the Center for Art, Democracy, and Popular Culture, where we just asked people about all of their media that they consume. What are your favorite movies? What are your favorite podcasts? What are your favorite TV shows? Like favorite influencers? And the percentages we could get from a, several thousand, like big sample of American adults were like maybe 10% of people started to hit something. So it's just everybody's getting things wherever they want to, whenever they want to. But the flip I'll offer is, your last comment about how could we maybe start to think about combating some of AI. I do think that one of our problems, and this fits really nicely maybe with the first answers too about media landscapes and that credibility and knowledge and who do we trust, is that when we can localize who we are communicating with, whether that be local media sources, but also just literally people in my neighborhood or my community that live in Fort Collins or Northern Colorado. Those are opportunities for us to be able to push back on that because there is a realism there that we can trust. It's that when we start to rely heavily on our media and content at a national or international or TikTok scrolling level, that AI risk gets really big.
That point about the focus on local being more accurate, I heard a report today about the Wisconsin gubernatorial race, and they were talking to folks who were on the street, going door to door, talking to people about the governor's race. And the question that people had was, what does the candidate think of Donald Trump? So even in a local race for their own state, they weren't focused on issues of their own state. They're so conditioned to think of everything nationally at this point. They weren't even asking about what was going on locally with the candidate. I think it reinforces what you're pointing out. Yeah.
Just jump in with that in terms of when you do polling on Americans' trust in government, local governments are trusted the most. Then it goes down, state governments a little less, and then federal government is trusted less. So it's interesting that local government is still where people have a lot of confidence. And I think good journalism reinforces that, right? If people know that there are local reporters looking out for, what's happening, watching what's happening with local government, that helps, reinforce that trust that people do instinctively have for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, kind of this takes us into this next question. A major focus of current concern is the loss of local news. And in our program that we've had, we've learned about the demise of local news and the rise of the corporate control of media, which has been mentioned, both in Colorado and the nation. We've seen how these trends are straining the fabric of our relationships, our communities, democracy. Mr. Vahlenkamp, would you share your thoughts about recent and impending changes to Colorado and national media
Sure.
and suggest what we can do to protect these valuable assets?
I guess the first thing I would say is it's the demise of local news maybe is overstated, depending on the market. If you look at some of the markets we cover, Longmont, where I live, as well as in Boulder, there is now competition that was not there before. Um, in Longmont, we have in addition to us, we're the more traditional outlet. We still deliver print editions, but we also are online 7 days a week. We have competition that is online and is local, has a local writer. You can look them up, but we also have a couple of other journalists who are professional, and they're going it alone. They're creating these websites, and they're doing some local production, videos, and or other type of media. So they're out there, and if you look in Boulder as well, there's the Boulder Reporting Lab, who is our competition there. So and in markets, in certain markets, I'm not going to say all markets, there definitely is still a lot of competition, and I think it's because there is an appetite for local news. Um, in terms of, and I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question. Maybe it was what do we do about it? I do know that certain, and there are markets where that's not the case. Smaller communities, especially you look at some communities on the Eastern Plains, some communities, smaller communities in Southern Colorado that have completely lost um, their newspaper, whatever their local outlet was. Um, I don't have a solution for that. That's very difficult because those are communities that themselves may have a hard time supporting any kind of business. The thing is, this is still, at least from where I'm coming from, yeah, you have to make some money to stay in business. You have to be able to sell some. There might be some solution for those really isolated small markets that I've not thought of, and maybe someone else on this panel has. Um, but uh, but I would just say in general, if you're someone who cares about what goes on in your community, support your local media. Do subscribe to it. A lot of it now is available online, which is a lot less expensive to deliver to you. Again, I'm giving you a pitch here, but but the solution is for the people who are interested to read. One concern I have is that there's a generation, I think, of people coming up who have um, maybe no interest, I think, in this, because you can get, as other panelists have suggested, you can hear what you want to hear or read what you want to read at any time, right? So if what's the interest in hearing about some minutia that happened at a local board meeting, or maybe some budget problem in the local school district, if you don't have kids in school, or you don't have it, or perhaps you just moved to town, and your interests, you can have your interests taken care of just by putting on a set of earbuds and listening to something else. Hope that answers your question, at least to some extent.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick, I guess. One thing that you raised, John, was this idea that people don't really care, I guess, to put it bluntly. I can't think of a nicer way to put it right now.
Yeah.
That's also like a major concern. I'm teasing two themes right now. One is sort of the question, the part of the question I actually didn't answer, which is about the impact on the election, um, and which is that we have fake stuff coming out from various quarters, right, at various degrees of falsity. But it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter if you can discriminate true news from false news if you don't care, right? So, and hopefully that's a very small proportion of people who both have the capacity to do so and don't care about the outcome. But the bigger problem I think is where people don't even aren't even invested enough to build that skill or to put in that effort to segment the good quality from the poor quality. And I'm also thinking simultaneously about Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you haven't read that, it's just a declaration put up by the United Nations. It not legally binding, but one that asserts a lot of very worthy, uh, qualities that we should all strive for in our governments. And Article 19 in part covers access to information, and it states that access to information is a right. And so, in some sense, if I'm going to be really dramatic, I would say that these communities on the Eastern Plains that don't have access to information are fundamentally being deprived of a human right, which sounds a bit dramatic, but nonetheless, I think is true. But also, if you don't go out of your way to seek good information, then there is going to be very little impetus for a third party to come to your community to provide good information. And so this creates this kind of self-reinforcing loop where if people stop caring, then those few people who do care about providing good quality journalism are going to be disincentivized to provide it. And this is all going to be, from my perspective as an AI researcher, this is all being exploited for gain by the big AI companies because they're there and they have the resources to fill in the gaps and give people what they think they want at any given time, kind of at the push of a button.
Anyone else? Okay, if not, we're going to move on to talk a bit about our children. A recent data essay from December 2025, published by the Pew Research Institute, reported that young adults under 30 follow news less closely than any other age group. And when it comes to political news, Pew reports that 70% of young adults say they get it because they happen to come across it, generally online and often on social media outlets like TikTok, Instagram, or influencers, podcasts, and Substack, that kind of thing. Dr. Pennington, this question is for you. How do you see these trends impacting our elections and our democracy? And how can we help our young people get credible, nonpartisan information so that they can participate meaningfully in the democratic process? Tall order.
Yeah, I'll just solve that in the next couple of minutes. It's no problem. No, I think this is a great question. I mean, I think several of our answers have already started to kind of touch on some of these concerns. And I will say I was excited briefly. Pew actually had another report that came out just a couple weeks ago that made the numbers look a little better. So I can actually share their new one. I said it just came out, and they build on that older data. I say older, last year's data. So numbers are looking a little bit better. So more recently, for instance, now we're looking at like 64% of young adults are saying that they follow national news at least somewhat closely, which is nice to see those numbers increasing. The previous survey, it was about 53% of people in that age group. And so I think part of that is the remembering one survey could only tell us so much. So it's good to, constantly be asking and thinking and learning and knowing more as we're going into midterms. I'm not surprised that maybe we're seeing an uptick in people saying that they're engaging with news. But I think the most important takeaway from that Pew article that goes to what we were already talking about with the concerns with artificial intelligence and good news and accurate or real news is that incidental exposure. And it's that people are saying, I'm scrolling TikTok, Instagram, Reels, and just all these very visual, these 30-second, 1-minute clips that are giving them content that they don't know where the information came from. And in those same Q articles, they acknowledge that young adults don't know if those are good things or not for them. Oh, is this real? I don't know. Older adults also at least acknowledging they're not entirely sure if they're able to know if that's real, accurate content either. But that doesn't make it a good thing. It just is. All of us, I think, are struggling. So yes, young adults it's an issue because this is their primary access point. I think everybody has a concern about, is the news I'm getting good news, or concerns that the people around them are getting good or accurate news as well. And so I'm going to fall back to what I said a little bit ago about, I think kind of one of the things here is the local, but not just the local news. Like part of what I want to stress from my own research that I do. And so I really am interested in how we're building social connection, community, belongingness, is that when people don't feel connected to their neighbors or don't feel connected to, right, the space that they are existing, both the people and the place, that's when they turn to and start scrolling social media to find connection, right? And so researchers who study things like how young men end up, on the dark net and part of these groups that, but they were just trying to find community at first, right? I just want somebody who like understands me for who I am. And now I'm also getting these very particular political views as a result because I followed this for my interests, not the political things. And so I think that's where an answer we might not expect is really to just say, how am I building community? So holding events, talking to people, making sure we know our neighbors, and instilling that in young adults who don't always have those spaces as readily available for them. I think that becomes the like stepping stone to then follow the local news, right? Like, gosh, everywhere I've moved and I've moved for college jobs a few times. The first thing I do is subscribe to the local newspaper because I learned so much more about my community by being there, and then just the things you can gain from that. And so I think, um, you know, ways we can encourage connection can then spill over to some of that political process as well, right? And remembering that the civic engagement informs.
Mhm.
I saw like two comments drop up in the chat, which I can try to tackle. Others can too.
I think aren't we gonna hold those?
Okay, we're gonna hold. Okay.
Yeah, so we can keep going and we'll make
Okay.
sure we have time. Would anyone else like to comment?
Just a couple of things. I think we were talking about there at the end, Natalie, is we in political science call it social capital, right? The network of relationships that people have through being together and things like neighborhood associations or civic groups or whatever. And, it's been well documented that has been in decline in the United States for a long time. So we're kind of, and as we were talking about too, people caring about, in a democracy, I'm always telling my students, in a democracy, it's not a spectator sport, right? People have to be involved, right? Or democracy doesn't work. So some of these issues that we come back to and talking about the media, I think are fundamental just to the health of our society and our democracy. The other thing I want to say too about, we were talking about the randomness sometimes of people's knowledge. I find that in my students all the time. I sometimes call it episodic knowledge. People know something really detailed about some little thing, but they don't know how to fit it into a bigger picture of what's going on. And I think part of that is our lack of civic education. So I find a lot of my teaching is just trying to give people the bigger picture so that when they learn something, they know how to fit it in to a more, to know what to do with it, right? I mean, you randomly see something on TikTok, right? And then if you don't know a bigger context, you don't know what to do with it, right? So anyway, just a thought.
I want to very quickly jump on what Jeff just said. Thank you for saying that, Jeff, because it reminded me of something that I want to shout out to everyone here. I was just being asked about young adults. I actually have a delightful friend I've known since we competed against each other in college debate back in the day. But Lindsay Cormack wrote a really fantastic book called How to Raise a Citizen that is so good, so wonderful, public facing book that is getting at what Jeff was just saying, right? So let's like start even earlier than the college aged or 18 to 29-year-olds, but saying how do we ensure that children have these values and understand what it means to be a part of a democracy.
There certainly is a move, I think, to teach civics or return to teaching some civics in schools, early on to give people some sense of it. And I think your point also about interacting is important because as a psychologist, I can say that the research on certainly teenage girls who use their phones more often, 10 to 14, you've seen the research, uh, and it's striking. I mean, they report, of course, being more bullied. They report being more depressed, even more suicidal, but they report being more isolated, even though they're spending all this time on their devices, as opposed to human interaction. That's striking. Which sort of leads to the next question, a little more generic in a way. We've touched on this a bit. Maybe we can dig into it just a little bit more. In regard to AI and how it's infiltrating every area of our lives, maybe you could all weigh in on how you see it impacting your area of expertise, either positively, negatively, or both. You've touched on it a bit. And what policy options might we explore to help manage it effectively? Professor Borg, how will is AI affecting the practice of journalism and journalists going forward? And I'll ask each of you some version of this question.
Well, I was thinking similar lines, but a little bit differently about this. So I've been thinking lately about how AI can distort campaigns and interfere with democracy. And there was a really interesting TED Talk on by a woman from young woman, elected official from Northern Ireland, and it's called "How a Deep Fake Almost Ruined My Political Career." And this happened to her in 2022. Has somebody seen this? It's a like a 13-minute, like TED Talks are, but it's really powerful. But came out like this deep fake showing her in a pornographic movie. It came out like 3 weeks before an election. It just put her in a terrible position to try and there was no real infrastructure to kind of help her say it's not true, right? Now it's true that campaigns have always been, yeah, there it is. Campaigns have always been that way. I mean, people have always lied and given dirt about their competitors, right? So I mean, politics has always sort of been a dirty business, right? But the thing with AI and deepfakes, I mean, just using deepfakes as an example of how AI can be dangerous, they're getting so realistic, right? So it is really hard to distinguish, and as we said, it's changing all the time. And then too, the rapidity with which they spread. I mean, on social media, these things can spread just so fast, right? So this is sort of like what we've always had, this kind of, trying to slime your opponent, right? But it's now on steroids, right? So, well, what I saw last week, the New York Times had an article, and it was called Finland. Finland is the one country that has been doing a great job for years and years on media literacy, training not only their children at schools and their school system, but also when they're citizens about how to understand disinformation. I mean, they started back in the 50s in the Cold War, having that long border with the Soviet Union. Now they're concerned about Russia misinformation. So they really think that media literacy is part of their national security. So I think Finland can be a great model for looking at what works. But anyway, this article was titled Finland Tries to Protect Children from Deepfakes, but AI is a Challenge. And it was a really interesting article because they're talking about what they're trying to do. I mean, the deepfakes are so realistic now, they're really having a hard time giving young people advice on how to spot them. So what they did was actually they had young people create deep fakes, right? To get a sense of like how it works, right? So I mean, it's one of the strategies they use. And I think, I don't know if I think people are struggling with what are the strategies now that we give citizens to distinguish between what's real and what isn't when you see things. That's, I kind of want to put that out there that, I think in general, media literacy, we need a much better job in the United States on this. And then particularly, I think we're struggling. Even the places like Finland that are farther along the road are struggling with how now to separate what's real and what isn't.
Dr. Krishnaswamy, in our last program or last session of the program, we learned that cognitive liberty is the right to self-determination over one's own thoughts. What should we be doing to protect our cognitive liberty today when big tech has the ability to interfere with human agency?
Yeah, so I'll use the term I used earlier, which is epistemic vigilance. And I'm going to cast this in terms of actually Finland and deepfakes, because that's a really great example. Uh, Finland has been training kids to basically view media critically since the 1950s. And so they're way ahead of where we are. We're obviously starting from, we could roll out programs like this at scale in all public schools in the US and still be like centuries behind. But what that does is it effectively creates that scaffold to be epistemically vigilant from a young age. And really what that comes down to is when you look at a very realistic, say, AI generated video, oftentimes you'll see, say, people who make these features kind of showing a AI video and then pointing out like here's why I can tell that it's AI. And they often look at like visual factors of the video and look at there's some like physical unreality here, there's some artifacts, there's this AI blur. These are all valid indicators for the current state of the technology. I would assume at some point even those are going to become harder to detect, but that in itself is not epistemic vigilance in a way that guards cognitive liberty. What that does, what will do that is actually really an assessment of at some level for many things, what am I seeing and is it plausible? Because I can generate at this point probably with the right tools in a few minutes generate a hyper realistic video of some political figure I dislike saying something abhorrent. Um, and the first thing that I would want someone to consider when viewing that would be, okay, is it plausible that this person would actually say this thing? Because that's going to probably filter out, I don't know, 60 to 70% of, that's just a very rough ballpark figure, but 60, 70% of the fake videos is simply yes, it looks really real, but what it depicts is just fundamentally implausible. Like a good Hollywood sci-fi movie depicts things that look really real, but d don't actually occur. And so at some level, AI is just sort of hyperinflated special effects. Um, when we think about what the tech companies are doing, right, and this gets back to the cognitive liberty, is that they try to keep people engaged. And the reasons for this are very basely economic, and every day you hear some AI CEO saying something insane. But at a more prosaic level, it's because they're burning money, and the only way to recoup that is to grow the customer base. And there aren't that many more people available on the planet. So what you need to do is you need to retain your existing customers and keep them coming back. And so that is, I think, the clearest indicator of big tech active encroachment on cognitive liberty. When you use the term cognitive liberty, the cynical part of me immediately thinks, well, there is no such thing as true cognitive liberty because all our thoughts are being influenced by people around us and events as they're happening. So, in some sense, if you take a deterministic view, none of us have true control over all our thoughts at any given time. What we want to do is we want to maintain, the maximum level of control over our thoughts that is possible, right? We do not want to be offloading cognitively our own capability to someone or something else. And so what we're seeing in the AI space are these other two cognitive terms, which is cognitive offloading, which you may have heard of, which is where you offload the work of doing hard thinking to an AI system. Supervening upon that is something that we call cognitive surrender, which is basically where the line between what you think and what the AI is generated and outputted is blurred to the point that you used an AI system to help you with some task, and you basically just adopt the AI's output as your own, right? And that is as the term suggests, that would be the antithesis of cognitive liberty, because you are no longer guarding your own thoughts. In fact, you are actively engaged in the process of giving them over to something else. And if you take it a step further, you're actively engaged in basically adopting something else's thoughts as your own. And that would be the ultimate act of not maintaining guardianship over your own thoughts. So these two sort of terms of cognitive liberty and epistemic vigilance obviously go hand in hand. It's something that's going to have to be educated into our new generation, from the start. I've got a daughter entering kindergarten this year, so I'm going to see how that works out. But, this is something that is would require national level effort. But if I'm being quite honest, I do not see that happening anytime soon. I do not think that our government is going to be instituting a 1950s like Finland like program for media literacy anytime soon. It's something that's going to happen at the local level, right? And so this is something that like in the Pooter School District and the Thompson School District and all these other St. Vrain, right, we're going to have to be actively engaged in developing these programs. And that comes back to local engagement, right? Because who is going to be doing those things is going to be like parents of kids who want these programs in the school. It's going to be the school board members. It's going to matter who gets elected to the school board. It's going to matter who is financing anyone who is running for a local position, right? Maybe you don't get heavy financing in school board, but you certainly do in some state level races, right? Or even like state senate, state house. These things matter. And so it really is there's two types of self-reinforcing cycles going on. One is the virtuous cycle where engaged citizens, help create low-level change that creates an example for states and the federal government. And then there's the vicious cycle, which is where people disengage, and then a large actor with lots of money steps in and basically assumes, control over their thinking and how they act based upon those thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. This question is for Dr. Pennington. How do you see AI affecting education in your department and the university? Are blue books on the horizon making a comeback?
I'm going to answer that. I want to make a very, very quick comment about the media literacy stuff.
Please.
So incredibly important. One of the things, though, as somebody, so I'm in communication studies as my background in my area. And when I teach classes, I taught persuasion this summer, and students' only task was to have to persuade their peers on a communication topic of their choice. And a bunch of people picked misinformation. They have those concerns, which is amazing. And media literacy is a great point, but that's the education side. And so I think, both of them were making the comment that we have to have the infrastructure to build it out. But if we know some people are learning it, then one of the things that I want to encourage, if you haven't read and looked at, is looking at misinformation correction strategies. So there are communication studies researchers looking at ways we can make sure that when we see misinformation and we know how to find it and identify it, that we know how to tell the person who shared the misinformation that that thing was wrong. And so thinking about that communication approaches we can take with correction, a huge one. On the education front, department, university, it's a lot to tackle as a teacher, I'll say. I taught persuasion online this summer. It was my first time teaching online in a few years. And so that was a reminder for me about how much things have changed. I do know faculty across the university who have returned to Blue Books. I think another strategy, again, comm person, so near and dear to my heart, is reminding people that it is really hard to talk about a topic. So yes, we put a really strong emphasis on writing, and we should continue to talk about writing, but encouraging more often the students in my classes to demonstrate their ability to have a conversation about the thing that they are studying, to really demonstrate their skill set. And then it's also about engaging with it, right? So I think to some extent we have to acknowledge that there, at least for Colorado State University, there are partnerships that exist. And so I think some expectations about what it means to use or connect. And so for the Comm Studies department, we're actually developing a set of courses that will focus on thinking about artificial intelligence in the context of different areas. So for instance, we actually have two faculty who are part of our rhetoric and social and civic democracy initiatives creating an AI and democracy class. I'm working with Dr. Murafa for one that focuses on AI and personal relationships and thinking about communication technology use, right? Those concerns we were talking about with like mental health professionals and our people who say, oh, well, my AI chatbot is my friend, and what that means for our different relationships that we have as well. Dark side class, so one that sort of says, hey, what if like this is all maybe scary for us? And then also a 200 level skills class. So saying, if you want to engage with, what does it mean to do so responsibly? And so I think it's balancing those two parts to say, how can we give students the tools and have the conversations and talk about what it means to use these things and how and why, but also thinking about what does it mean for us to do assignments, how we've done them in the past, and how does that change? The very last piece I'll say is, I've said a few times, I would love to talk to faculty who were just starting teaching like right when the internet became a big thing, because I do feel like AI is like really kind of up there with us in terms of changing how we approach the classroom.
And also on this topic, Mr. Vahlenkamp, how has AI impacted your newsroom? And how might it affect the battle for local news going forward? I think.
Yeah. First of all, we do use it, but it's limited. We have a company policy that restricts its use very severely. You're not going to read something that we've published that was produced by AI. It might be used in when it comes to doing some research for helping pull something out of a multi-page document. And we use things like spell check and grammar check. I'm sure that's probably relying on AI as well. So we have to do that more than I wish we had to, but it's still smart to do. I think I was thinking about this today, how it makes it one way it makes it more difficult to us is we have more competition now from we mentioned bad actors, people who want to put misinformation out there and could do it more easily. Something and I that just today and we got a press release from the Larimer County assessor pointing out that offices in Larimer County are receiving questions from people who are I don't know where they're getting this messages, but there's apparently some messages out there saying that there's I'm having to read this new federal property tax benefits, exemptions, and tax forms. And so these people are getting this messages. I don't know whether they're coming emails or some other place, but people are thinking this is real, and so now they're reaching out to the county saying, "Hey, is this really happening?" From my perspective, one of the issues is we have even more competition than we had before. Competition that can quickly disseminate false information. Additionally, we've even had briefly a competitor pop up in one of our markets that was entirely AI created. It didn't last very long, but it was you see the images of the community, you think that's not what Main Street looks like, and you read it and you think, hold on, I think some of this actually came from our own reporting, which it did. So it just makes it easier for one person who has the access to AI and the willingness or just the desire to spread information. Makes it a lot easier for them to do so. And if you don't have a discerning audience, and I can't speak to this any better than anyone else on the panel here, but if you don't have a discerning audience who knows how to spot that when they see it, you can have a lot of misinformation spread. And I think to some extent, people want they want what is fascinating and interesting, and they think, oh, I saw this in this location, it must be real. Why aren't you reporting? Rather than question the reality of this fascinating thing that was given to them, they question the person who's not telling them this fascinating thing. But from our perspective, it just means we have to be more vigilant, watching what people submit to us, and also watching what's out there that's fake and doing our best to counter it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Well, here's one final question for all of you. Anybody can jump in. Hopefully, we will all be voting this fall, the elections this fall. What are the biggest risks that artificial intelligence and emerging technologies pose to our upcoming elections? And how do these tools impact political polarization? Are there concrete steps we can take to address these threats and safeguard the elections and democracy?
Yeah, so I'll jump in real quick. I think in one of my classes, probably in each of my classes, I use the same metaphor for AI. And so what we've talked about with AI is, is it like satellites or nuclear weapons or fire or something? The metaphors that seem most compelling to me are the different information processing technologies that we've developed throughout history, that is writing, the printing press, and as Natalie mentioned, the internet. So AI is kind of alongside those. The reason I say that is because each of those technologies progressively lower the bar for entry And it changed the nature of how we process truth. So before, in pre-literate societies, all kind of knowledge was orally transmitted. And so if you did not enforce fidelity in the oral transmission, then each instance of the same, tale that you got was different. With the advent of the printing press, it meant now that documents could be communicated in the local vernacular language and could much more easily be created. With the internet, what that did is that allowed almost anybody with a connection to create, say, a blog or like an online voice. But what it didn't do, which is what AI is doing now, is it didn't give you automatic access to an audience. Because your blog could just languish out there on the internet, no one would ever find it. Now with AI, the barrier is even lower, right? You don't actually have to write the thing yourself. You can prompt an AI model to write your post, your article, or create a video or a presentation for you. And it also gives you ready-made access to platforms like TikTok and Instagram and these that allow you to sort of get it in front of a potentially large audience almost immediately. And so that creates a real risk, right? So at the same time that we can say that like it's democratizing access to creation of I'll just say content. But at the same time, it's also creating a risk of AI slop, we all know the term, being shoveled out there en masse. And that I think does create a risk in principle to the elections, because there's potential for like a whole lot of false stories that can be rapidly generated. One thing that was interesting is that we kind of had this conversation in 2024 as well. People were really worried that 2024 is going to be like the first AI slop election, and there's relatively limited evidence that actually happened. Because there's not a whole lot of evidence, I think, maybe I'm wrong, that large volume of AI slop necessarily changed lots of voting behavior. We'll see if that's the case here. I think it goes back to my earlier concern of whether or not people care that they are being exposed to large volumes of untrue AI generated material. And so because I think it has probably increased in volume since 2024 and also increased in quality in terms of like the quality of the artifact. There it creates a bigger risk of people being taken in by AI generated media, and that may have an effect on voting patterns. I also worry about things maybe on election day. We did hear a few things during the 2024 election of like bomb threats being called into polling places. That's potentially also exacerbated by AI. You could auto-generate realistic voices calling in threats to polling places, for example. So I think that it. I don't want to discourage anybody, and it's a little late to be developing the cognitive scaffolding for the 2026 midterms, given that it's August. So we have to, one, cross our fingers and hope for the best, but at the same time, also, be active in getting out the quality vetted information, and hope that we hope that we haven't failed to predict some kind of skullduggery that might be enacted. I've been thinking a lot about like what are the possible ways that people could try to throw a monkey wrench in the election, and nothing comes to mind as like, oh my God, this is a ticking time bomb that is just gonna throw everything into chaos. But I do worry that I haven't thought of something. I worry about a failure of imagination.
Thanks. Anyone else like to comment?
Well, I guess, what concerns me is just disinformation, whether it comes from AI or other malign actors, whether it be, Russia or some other, domestic group, but that would discourage people from voting, right? That would somehow undermine people's trust. And, for instance, like Mexican American folks getting, things on TikTok, seeing things on TikTok that say, well, if you vote, your name goes to immigration, or things like that, right? So, but then I think we need to tell the story. Yeah, it's too late to totally rebuild scaffolding, but in Colorado, we have like the gold standard of voting, right? Our system of voting is incredibly inclusive and efficient and very, very secure. And again, here in Larimer County, we have very high standards for how votes are counted, and even like if there's a discrepancy on the signature, right? They don't, if the signature doesn't match, right, on the mail-in ballot versus what's on the record, they don't just throw the ballot away. They actually will call people and check, And so, I mean, we have a really good system here in Colorado for voting, and I think we just need to let people know that, it's hey, vote, right? There's nothing, it will count, and it will count, and there's nothing that'll happen to you for voting.
Mhm. Anyone else?
I'll sneak in real quick just to say, and I keep going back to the communicate. It's a calm person, I can't help it, but the communication piece of it, right? So it's that when I see it, have the conversations, and part of what stuck out with me with your question, Dan, was thinking about, in particular, just we know that there's increasing political polarization. So the AI piece of it aside, but that increased polarization, some of the research that I've done that focuses on interpersonal political conversations that we have with strong ties and weak ties, we know that really strongly held emotions and bigger polarization means less chance for having those conversations. And so really trying to, as yourselves even, right? Like, and I know that I myself have fallen prey to this sometimes where I'm like, I have family members with totally different views than my own, but trying to be better about practicing that initial curiosity. Okay, well, I'd love to know why you think that. Where did you hear that from? Can you talk to me more about it? Right? Not in a like interrogating kind of way, but learning kind of way. And that might reveal, or at least let them start to see, oh, wait, I believed this was true because I saw this video on TikTok and it must be. Right. And so hopefully encouraging those conversations can help us start to unpack some of those differences and acknowledge times where our sources might not be good.
Anyone else? Well, we have reached the end of our questions for you, panelists. I think we do have some questions in the chat, which we can pass along, see what you want to do with those. The first question I see here is, how do you think the numerous paywalls affect the delivery of news?
I think that one's for me, isn't it?
Well, it was a while back, but I bet it might have been.
Well, um, let's see. I'll answer it this way, which is that yes, we charge for news, and when someone asks this question about why, I said, well, what business are you in, and do you sell what you produce? But I will say this: that when it comes to public safety matters, we do push that outside our paywall. I wouldn't want if there were a flash flood warning, or if there was a fire that was threatening the community. And in cases of someone who is an at-risk individual who is missing and needs to be found, if we've kept that behind our paywall, let me know right away, right? Because that's something we shouldn't do. Otherwise, really, I work for a company that makes money, and that's how I keep my job. So a paywall is necessary. That is difficult. We do face we'd have competition that for which news is free. I can't change that. So our job is to do our best to cover local matters that in a way that no one else will, and also the matters themselves, the news itself that no one else will. So I don't have a good answer for you. How do I think it affects news? And so it just means in some cases you got to pay for it.
And it does seem it affects different organizations in different ways based on their fundamental values of what it means to be a journalist, I would say. So it can be, I guess the question sort of suggests that maybe, you sort of mess around with the news, but it really comes down to values, doesn't it? And the ethics of journalism and people understanding what that means, what the difference is between influencers and journalists, where there's accountability and so forth.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that any place that you're getting free news isn't necessarily a good and have solid reporting. That's going to be the case, but certainly there are places digitally. There are places where you'll get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm.
I just jump in there and
Yeah.
I don't know when it was sometime that we got this idea with the internet that news ought to be free, right? That we just ought to be able to see the news. But we can blame the media all we want, go through all the problems with the media, but we have to look at ourselves too, that uh, if we want good stuff, and journalism is a highly trained profession. I mean, it's you know, it, the journalists do such important work. They deserve to be paid, right? And we need to pay, whether it's subscribing to our local newspaper or donating, money to the Colorado Sun or some of these nonprofit news. We just got to suck it up and say, hey, if we want good information, we got to pay for it, right? And this whole thing about like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna go online. I get frustrated too if there's I look at there's an article in the Los Angeles Times and well, that's just what I'm looking at, and then there's a paywall, right? We all get frustrated with that, but we're just gonna have to admit that if we want good journalism, we're gonna have to pay for it in some way.
Mhm. Well, it is the nature of a capitalistic system that it's an economic system that does require certain things, but it doesn't mean it negates honesty and it necessarily negates honesty and integrity in the news, right? Okay, this question is there a difference between reading or hearing news and seeing visual AI generated content? Does it get in your head more? Would more reading be a good strategy, or depends on your mode of thinking? Obviously, AI can be used for audio and text too, but it seems like visual has really shifted things.
Yeah, the video generation models are, I think, the thing that obviously draw the most attention, because we regarded for a very long time as like video is the gold standard, the thing that cannot be faked. And then it turns out that you can fake video relatively well. So that obviously has raised a lot of concerns. We have to contextualize this in the just over the last couple of years, though. It was 2022 when we realized when it became well known that you could fake language. So before ChatGPT, I just want to point this out. Generating human-like fluent on-topic language was still not a solved problem. We got pretty close, but the most sophisticated models would not be able to write more than say a paragraph, and often would introduce logical inconsistencies, and things like that. And now we have models that still, hallucinate, generate things that are false, but know obviously more than a human writing on the same topic. And so when we fast forward from like that, which was like late 2022 to maybe late 2025 or early this year, which is where I would say video generation models kind of really crested the wave. That's a very short time span, right? And that predicates that we can either go acceleration, or plateauing from here on out. I tend to err on the side of plateauing, but I'm not entirely sure. But what it does is that visual media is just grabs your attention in a way that text doesn't at mass scale. And so it obviously does depend on your mode of thinking. Some people are more textual learners, some people are more visual learners. Um, but most people, when you see or hear something, it does tend to stick with you in a way that reading something doesn't. And so it also allows you to communicate more information in less time than reading. Right? You can, if you had an article that took you 13 minutes to read, probably a video version of that article could communicate the same information in half that time or less. So, in terms of volume and in terms of the type of information that most humans process most readily, yes, visually generated AI does kind of probably have a higher volume effect than others. And part of that, I think, is also because we thought for a long time that like images and videos could not be faked. And it turns out
Mm.
they can be faked.
This is a question for the entire panel. What is your opinion about the Ellison family, who not only owns Paramount and TikTok, but is rapidly expanding on more media companies with the goal to own the majority of media consumed by Americans? I don't know if that's a topic for this or a subject for this topic, but in case anyone would like to comment, feel free.
So I put my opinion in the chat. My opinion is that Larry Ellison is a weird looking dude. Um, More generally, I think just the rapid collapsing of media into different companies is kind of a symptom of where we are right now. And so when I think about this from the perspective of the AI companies, which of course, being an AI person, this is what I think of most frequently. It really is just kind of parallel to that, right? You basically have Oracle is not a AI company per se, but it's a large tech company, and they are engaged in the same business of trying to buy up as many different types of companies as possible. And probably every one of like the top 10 richest people in the world now is kind of talking the same game, which is they basically want to be the person who runs everything, right? Elon Musk most famously wanted X to be the everything app. So far, thank goodness, has not achieved that. But what they do, and when you have more money than, most small nations make over their history, and you don't know what to do with it, it's kind of seems natural you're just gonna like buy up companies and get your tentacles in everywhere that you can. Um, I think it's kind of I guess it's notable that the Ellison family maybe is a little more upfront about this. I guess their goal is to own media specifically, whereas other tech companies' goals are to own just like a little piece of everything like, that touches people's lives. Um, I don't think this is obviously, I don't think this is a good thing if you hadn't been able to glean that from my response so far. But I think it's really very similar to what we see going on, kind of across the merger landscape right now. And it's a goal that very much infringes upon our cognitive liberty, right? Why else would you want to own every form of media that is consumed by Americans? Um, I can't really think of a altruistic reason for that. And so, you know, that is my opinion.
The only thing I'll add to that is just, and I think that you're making all very good points on this one, is that fragmentation question. And so what I think what's really interesting with this is if we're saying people's media are fragmented, but media is starting to be owned by all the same people, then, I think it's a smart for researchers, but also everyday members of the public to be aware of when those sources are the same, right? And you're like, oh gosh, I'm seeing this in 5 different papers. Well, if they all are owned by the same, parent company, then that's where I think that really kind of starts to come into play. I had mentioned it briefly earlier and was going to drop a link for it in the chat. That Center for Democracy, Art, and Popular Culture that was launched at Colorado State this past year. Dr. Kari Anderson and Dr. Nick Marks in my department are the co-runners of that. But one of the things we did when we were looking at and asking people what are the different media is that we have actually this big survey. We were saying, okay, well, if all of these media are coming from the same type of source, are we seeing some trends there? So being able to start to identify and say, okay, well, if I think I'm looking at and viewing all these different types of content, but they actually are all part of, right? We could probably go look at and see how much of it is Paramount content. It'd be interesting to see and help us understand more about what this looks like and means.
Okay. We're just about out of time. Any final comments at all from all of you? Any of you? Well, we certainly want to thank you for all your time and your insight. Actually, hearing all of what you're doing is very hopeful to those of us on the outside here looking in. Yeah, applause. You can see the applause on the screen. Thanks so much. And now let me turn it back to Linda to wrap things up. Linda?
Was I muted? Okay.
Yes, you were
Sorry,
muted.
I'm sorry. Okay, so thank you to our panelists and our audience. If you thought these workshops were worthwhile, please share them with others by directing them to our website, LWV-Larimer-County.org. You can find the recordings on our homepage. and under the drop down for news, events, news, videos, and events. Our goal has been to provide everyone with the tools they need to be a discerning information seeker using critical thinking to navigate the avalanche of fake news. Don't forget to vote in November. Everybody vote, go vote. And remember, if you see a fake, if you see an image of a shark swimming down Main Street, it's probably fake. Just go someplace else and read your news. Okay, thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.